Our afternoon session. My name is Gillian Balfour. I'm an associate professor of sociology here at Trent University, and so part of my connection to this weekend's events, Brian kindly asked me to chair a session, and I came to this sort of area of intellectual work in large part because of Joan and Brian. When I first came to Trent in 2003, and I told my colleagues out west that I was coming to Trent, one of the first things that people most said to me was, "Oh, Joan Sangster's there." And so when I came to Trent, I quickly learned what that meant. Joan has certainly been an inspiration and a huge mentor for people feminists coming to Trent, certainly. I got to know Brian in the trenches of what were probably some of the darkest days of Trent's faculty association. I learned a great deal about living according to principles and being true to yourself during that particular time, and I have huge respect for Brian Palmer. So the session that we have here this afternoon is the Marginality as Historical Subject. We have 3 papers that we're going to hear this afternoon. And the first one is from Ted McCoy. Ted is currently a historian teaching in the Law and Society program at the University of Calgary. He studied with Brian Palmer in the Canadian Studies PhD program here at Trent. He's published on colonial violence and prison labor, and in 2012 published a book on the history of the Canadian penitentiary. His current work looks at gender segregation in 19th century penitentiaries in Canada.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Gillian, for the introduction, and thank you to Brian. I was a PhD student with Brian between 2005 and 2011. And when asked about this experience, it's often assumed that I'm about to tell a story of hostage-like indoctrination. And students particularly are disappointed when I tell them that it was the opposite. That to be a graduate student with Brian Palmer is to be given a very long leash and to work with considerable freedom and I think the expectation of creativity. And I found this just really tremendously liberating and different from my other experiences with other supervisors. It did not mean that Brian would not give this leash a sharp tug if things were going off the rails. But he largely would set you to it and wait to see what you would bring back to him. So I'm going to give you an example of some of the work that I do. The paper I'm going to give is based on a chapter of a book called Defiance and Despair, which will come out next year or slightly after that. And it's a book which tracks the experience of prisoners in the women's ward at Kingston Penitentiary in the 19th century. So today I'm going to talk about a single woman whose experience in this ward highlights the range of marginalities that women risked in institutions like this. And I choose this woman because her experience is extreme, but in its extremity it illustrates the depth of possible marginalities and marginal spaces to which women, particularly imprisoned women, were consigned. So this included the women's ward itself, disciplinary spaces like isolation cells, and medical spaces reserved for medical or sexual deviancy. Each of these were often accompanied by categories of understanding women, things like unmanageable or incorrigible, or hysterical or lunatic or solicitous. Looking into how one woman, in my example, inhabited each of these categories, I ultimately suggest that to be marginalized by gender in a penitentiary was just one component of how women contended with and were oppressed by imprisonment. Beyond gender, which was significant, there were further realms of marginality that could be wholly dangerous or terrifying or alienating. Charlotte Ravel came to Kingston in 1845 to serve a 3-year sentence for larceny, which really meant petty theft. She was 24 years old, 5 foot 2 inches tall, white, and a fairly typical prisoner. One of a very small population of 30 women in a larger prison segregated from 300 men. Now, Charlotte distinguished herself very early in her sentence through small acts of personal defiance. Her first recorded disciplinary infraction was that she simply refused to walk from one place to another. Simple. But in the lockstep discipline of the early penitentiary, this set off a chain of disciplinary responses. So the head matron sent a written report noting Charlotte's refusal. The warden, Henry Smith, reviewed this and sent back his ruling on her punishment. This initial transgression earned Charlotte 24 hours in the dark cell on low diet, and this was an early form of solitary isolation. A stone cell containing nothing but a bucket without any light source whatsoever. Charlotte's resistance to penitentiary life began to intensify. She was reported 10 more times between July and August of 1846, and the offenses in the punishment register are reported nondescriptly, either as bad language or outrageous behavior. Each time she spent between 24 and 48 hours in this dungeon. And then something changed. On her 11th disciplinary report, Warden Smith ordered Charlotte to be whipped. She was then struck 6 times across the back with a rawhide horsewhip. Now, even in the 1840s, this would have been unusual, because only the most rebellious and incorrigible prisoners, women amongst them, were ever whipped at Kingston. And Charlotte was a very small minority in this respect. And in fact, she was the last woman ever whipped at Kingston Penitentiary, because by 1846, the reform opposition of Upper Canada was finally shining a light on the Kingston pen. And in response to the disciplinary or the outcry over disciplinary violence at the prison, corporal punishment in the aftermath of Charlotte's final beating was suspended. Now, her rebellious behavior is not altered by this whipping, and in its aftermath she becomes even more resistant. She was reported for great violence, for a vengeful feeling against the matron, for refusing to work, for destroying her clothing. She also turned her anger towards the penitentiary, destroying its property whenever she could. All of this earned Charlotte a staggering amount of time in the dark cells. Between July and December of 1846, she spent 34 total days in the dark on low diet. And low diet is not just bad food, but functionally no food. Bread and water, which in the 1840s was very, very meager indeed. So while whipping was suspended, the infliction of pain at Kingston was not. Kingston officials soon adopted a new form of punishment called the box. This was essentially an upright coffin in which prisoners were enclosed as a form of extreme isolation. It was both terrifying and extremely painful. When isolation in the dark cells could not curb Charlotte's rebellious behavior, officials turned to the box. So in March of 1847, Charlotte removed her shoes in a fit of anger and threw them over the interior fence of the penitentiary, out of the women's ward. This she immediately regretted, clearly recognizing what the consequence would be, and was apprehended while trying to climb over this fence to retrieve her shoes. The following morning, she was placed in a straitjacket, which is exactly as it sounds, and enclosed in this upright coffin, the box. Now, the standard punishment in the box lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. On this occasion, Charlotte was left in the box between 6 and 8 hours. She continued in this way. Resistance followed by a punitive response, and in total she was boxed 19 separate times in 2 months. This reached a crescendo in April of 1847. She endured 5 distinct and separate punishments in the box over the course of 6 days. So essentially, if we extrapolate, she spent 6 straight days in this box. On the 7th day of a low diet, she called the warden an old brute and told the matron, "They must not try to master me. I would rather die than give in." She was boxed again, and when the coffin was opened at the end of the day, Charlotte had collapsed. She could no longer walk or move her limbs. 2 keepers carried her back to her cell and summoned the penitentiary surgeon. So here things change again. But how do we explain this brutality? How do we make sense of it? I think the first thing that's important is to disrupt the narrative constructed by both penitentiary officials and subsequent reformers. We can move past the official responses and justifications for this punishment fairly easily, because under investigation, the administration which inflicted this punishment on Charlotte simply lied. The warden attempted to falsify the records to make it appear as though Charlotte had not endured punishment, and other officials simply lied and said it had never happened. This should suggest to us that Kingston officials knew that these punishments inflicted on Charlotte were both unjustifiable and inhumane. But I would suggest that we should also reject narrative explanations following from how reformers responded to this brutality. The lead reformer was named George Brown, and he investigated the abuses at Kingston, and his commission of inquiry roundly condemned the corporal punishment of women. They called this violence revolting inhumanity. But therein lies the problem. In condemning the first penitentiary administration as inhuman, as brutes, Brown quickly dispensed with seeking any sort of larger explanation for why or how such a thing could take place. And if we accept the explanation that Charlotte was brutalized in this way simply because of a lack of humanitarian concern, we as historians miss something larger as well. What I'd like to try to do is disrupt the narrative connected to Charlotte's corporal punishment and what happened next. The Brown Commission was investigating specifically a charge that corporal punishment had goaded Charlotte Revelle into a state of insanity. Now, we should be hesitant to accept the premise of such a charge. Still, the question of mental illness provides clues to begin to understand why Charlotte was punished in the way that she was, and what might have been the motivations for inflicting such terrible violence. She was not an isolated case at the penitentiary. 4 other prisoners were investigated, presumed to have been goaded into insanity. Now, for the Brown Commission, the connection of insanity and punishment was a cause and effect relationship, and it was further evidence of the inhumanity of prison discipline. They seem to suggest here is what it wrought, here's what it caused. But there is a deeper connection between the two. Prison records before the Commission of Inquiry made clear that most members of the penitentiary staff believed Charlotte was mentally ill well before her punishments began. Matrons on the women's wing raised this concern very early into her sentence. One informed the surgeon that it was the look in Charlotte's eyes and the way that she talked which convinced her of her instability. The doctor replied that while Charlotte was certainly odd, it was simply important not to let anything excite her mind. Other matrons tried to raise a concern with both the surgeon and the warden, but both reported that officials responded with general indifference. Now, this is a curious contradiction, given that these alarms were being raised at the same time that Charlotte was becoming increasingly disturbed and disturbing to the prison discipline. In turn, the result of this was that she did endure these repeated bouts of corporal punishment. I think that 2 explanations may suffice here. The first is that officials did not believe that Charlotte was ill, and so punished her as they would any other prisoner. But this becomes less convincing when the volume of Charlotte's punishments is compared to other prisoners and found to be far more frequent and far more intense. So a second, more convincing explanation that arises from this is that Kingston officials regarded Charlotte as insane and treated her roughly because of it. This type of brutal response to the mentally ill was entirely consistent with 19th century responses to insanity, both inside asylums and in other settings. So regarding Charlotte's punishment, we can come to a deeper explanation of why it happened if we can conclude not that her tormentors were heartless sadists, but that they acted as they did because it made rational sense to them based on who they believed Charlotte Revelle was. This too is actually more insidious and depressing as a conclusion, because it is societal and it's larger, and it does not visit responsibility for this type of violence on the shortcomings of a single man or an institution or an administration, but on a much larger idea. After her physical collapse, Charlotte spent the remainder of her sentence in the penitentiary hospital, and she found herself there subject to the medical authority of the surgeon James Sampson, struggling with both physical and mental deterioration. Physically, she suffered from something called menorrhagia, or excessive menstrual bleeding. This was accompanied by a range of very upsetting symptoms, including bloody vomiting, painful and swollen eyes, and extreme bowel obstruction. As her suffering worsened, Charlotte came to see the prison doctor as the source of her ongoing pain and became violent and resistant in response to his medical efforts. She finally, ultimately lost trust in the surgeon and began to strike back against him very violently. She resisted in this way by incurring disciplinary reports from her hospital bed in the hopes that she could communicate her fears about the surgeon to other penitentiary officials. So she called for help, or cried out for help. This speaks to the fact that becoming ill in the penitentiary was to be pushed even further into the margins of institutional life, Charlotte became very isolated, in communication with just two officials, the surgeon and the head matron. Now, a woman in the penitentiary, of course, had very little power, but a woman in the penitentiary hospital had none. Nobody considered her a rational agent, and so her entreaties fall on deaf ears. Charlotte's worsening medical condition also robbed her of control of her own body. So violent resistance was one way to try to break through this barrier. She would throw her belongings and her food, she tore at her blankets and clothing, she used vulgar language that she knew must be reported to the warden. In course, she became convinced that the doctor was giving her the wrong medicine and that it was making her even sicker. She told a hospital keeper, "He is giving me medicine that affects my head. This will drive me out of my mind." One day, as the doctor tried to administer a dose of this medicine, she screamed, "This is slow poison you are giving me." She grabbed a glass vial and smashed it against the wall. Finally, she told the surgeon she would take no more medicine and would give herself up to the care of the surgeon, or of the warden, sorry. Now this is incredible if we think about it, because Charlotte must have known that it was Warden Smith who had inflicted so much pain and suffering on her earlier in her sentence. And it's also tragic because she has nobody else to turn to at this point. Charlotte's physical deterioration was tied to her perceived mental instability. Mental illness for women in this era was often linked with all forms of reproduction and menstruation. Extreme uterine disease, as Charlotte suffered from alongside pregnancy or menopause, were believed to contribute to hysterical reactions in women. So if there were doubts about Charlotte's mental state before she became ill, the nature of her physical condition would likely have confirmed to the surgeon that she was, in fact, becoming a lunatic. Dr. Sampson's response to this condition was to treat the uterine disease in order to address both sides of the equation, both physical and mental. Unfortunately for Charlotte, medical thinking in the 1840s directed doctors to restore balance to a patient through purgative medicine. Charlotte was treated with a substance called calomel, which was a toxic mercury chloride compound taken orally. It produced instantaneous results of vomiting and diarrhea, but it was also accompanied by upsetting long-term side effects, including low pulse, tremors, painful swelling of the abdomen, swelling of the eyes, all symptoms which Charlotte suffered and were attributed to her uterine disease. Most distressingly, Charlotte suffered from the ultimate side effect of mercury poisoning, which caused personality damage or personality change, behavioral change, memory loss, and ultimately severe brain damage. So when Charlotte implored the warden to protect her from medical treatment, she literally begged him for relief from this slow poisoning that she suffered at the hands of the doctor. Now, a final series of events helps to illustrate the absurdity and the tragedy of Charlotte's case. In 1848, something changed again, and Dr. Sampson began lobbying the penitentiary administration to remove Charlotte, transfer her to the provincial asylum. Now, the surgeon was not necessarily motivated by humanitarian or medical concern. In any case, the asylum was hardly better than the penitentiary in 1847. Some officials began to suggest that Sampson was attempting to distance himself from a growing scandal about a perceived improper familiarity between himself and Charlotte Reville. Two matrons had reported to the warden that they had witnessed an incident between the surgeon and Charlotte that made them distinctly uncomfortable. Late in the evening, they said they saw the surgeon with his hands beneath the bedclothes and they believed between her legs. Both were laughing loudly enough to be heard beyond the walls of the women's ward. This was a scandal which grew substantially in the coming weeks, followed by an exhaustive investigation. Here we see a stark contrast with how officials responded to the facts of the violence faced by Charlotte earlier in the paper or in her sentence, and her perceived familiarity with the surgeon. The beating and the boxing of Charlotte prompted a single line of condemnation by reformers and very little further investigation. The possibility that she had sexually engaged with a prison official generated multiple hours of testimony and dozens of pages of written submissions from almost every official in the penitentiary, whether they had witnessed the incident or not. The original title of the chapter that I'm writing about this was called Charlotte Reville Fades Away, which I cut, I thought, for being too cute. But the metaphor of fading away or burning out seemed to describe to me the arc of Charlotte's struggle at Kingston Penitentiary. Her growing resistance and ultimately the brutal physical response that shattered her both physically and mentally. But even in the aftermath of this collapse, Charlotte continued to fight against the constraints of the penitentiary. And through these struggles, as I track them through the prison records, it truly does appear that Charlotte begins to fade from view. Until ultimately, this commission of inquiry is investigating her case and hearing testimony while she lies in bed in another part of the penitentiary, and nobody asks her for her opinion or for her version of the events that had happened. And ultimately, from the point of view of historians, she disappears completely from the prison record. She never appears in the register of discharged inmates. She ceases to show up in hospital records. She's on no death register. And I find no record of her anywhere in Ontario on any census or anywhere else. She simply slips away. And I don't know if she died or if she finally escaped the penitentiary. But she paid a big price for her struggle. That's it. Thank you.